we hardly have to tell you something that was rather obvious, and that was that Tim Russert always did his homework. He was always prepared for interviews. And during this year's presidential campaign, one of the biggest issues he studied up on was the war in Iraq. And that meant a lot of time talking to our correspondent, NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs correspondent, Richard Engel, who joins us this morning. Richard, good to have you here.
Thank you. Good morning.
You know, you and I both know the kind of mentor that Tim can be. And on an issue like Iraq, when you were in harm's way and showing so much courage, he was back here encouraging you a great deal and also checking a lot of facts with you. Talk about that.
He certainly was. He was always in contact, double-checking information, sending emails, calling. He was incredibly thorough, but it wasn't just that professionalism that I deeply respected. It was also his personal touch. He had an ongoing joke with me, and that involved my family. He knew that I was very close to my parents, and when I would come in and talk, he would ask about my mother and my father, and he even would make jokes on air. Well, give my best to your mother, and how is old mom? And my mother had a chance to meet him, and she said, well, you know, I'm not so old. Why are you calling me old mom on air? And they had a big laugh, and then he started calling her young mom. And it actually meant a lot to my mother to feel connected in that way, knowing that I was off in Iraq, but part of an organization that had people like Tim Russert who really reached out and made you feel part of a family.
Yeah, like Tom Brokaw, Tim, and Brian Williams, too, are an important voice for you, for all of us.
And it's especially important when you're overseas to feel part of connected something very, very powerful, very important, especially if they reach out to you like he always did.
The coverage of Iraq was obviously something that was important back to us here in Washington, to you as well on the front lines of reporting the war, and as it went on, even after the initial invasion. Talk to us a bit about the discussions you had with Tim in that way, too, because there's a lot of criticism about the run-up to the war and whether the press did its job. And, of course, you know, you were always a lightning rod as well, you and your colleagues who were there reporting the war up close.
If people thought that there wasn't enough criticism, I don't think they were pointing fingers at Tim Russert. He was always thorough. There was a story that really seemed to interest him a lot about Iranian influence in Iraq, and I remember him seeing emails and calling me and saying, is it really true that people down in Najaf will call and make hotel reservations in Farsi, and that there are many Iranian pilgrims just walking the streets? And it was the case, and he would use information like this, anecdotes that I would tell him firsthand to carry out his interviews, his cross-examinations with world leaders on Meet the Press. So he wasn't someone who just wanted to live within the Washington bubble, but to reach out to the people in the field and enrich what he was doing with what I was seeing.
And it means a lot to young reporters when you have somebody like Tim who's calling you and encouraging you.
It means the world.
And debriefing you as well.
It's very important. When I first came to NBC about 5 years ago, he was one of the first people who reached out to me and he said, who is this guy? Let's get him on the show. And he stayed in touch, and he was a tremendous supporter of young journalists who are starting out their careers. Sometimes that's not the case when you have big personalities and it's all about them. It was never the case with him.
Right. Richard, I could tell you from having watched your work and from knowing Tim that he always considered you to be the real deal, as your colleagues do as well. And from him, that was high praise indeed for the work that you've done and you continue to do. So Richard Engel up in New York this morning. Stay safe. Thanks for being here this morning to pay tribute to Tim.
Thank you.
On a personal note, this has been a very difficult time for our NBC family, and also for me personally. Tim was my boss, my mentor, and my friend. He took a risk when he hired me as a correspondent at 25 years old. He trusted me to cover Congress and the White House. I'll always remember getting a hot tip and calling Tim first. And he would be so excited. And when I covered the White House, we would talk before a presidential press conference or a big interview, and he would always end the call with, go get him. But I must say that it was Tim Russert, the man, Tim Russert, the father, that I will miss the most. I still have on my phone the voicemail he left when my twins were born, and he called to say congratulations and said, Mom, it's the greatest thing in the world. He would later send a note and the famous monogrammed pillows and said he wanted the kids to be interns at Meet the Press. I must also tell you that I was a little nervous this past year to go tell my boss, Tim, that I was pregnant again. I thought, oh no, I'm not going to be able to travel and cover the campaign. But we laughed about it. And then he said, you know, if I'd had a girl, I would have named her this. And I went home and I told my husband the name. And I never got to tell Tim that that's the name that we have chosen for our child. Tim loved children, and he loved his own son, Luke, so very much. And after this last primary, June 3rd, we sat next to one another on the flight home from New York, and he was showing me pictures off his BlackBerry of Luke traveling in Ireland. He was telling me how he traded in Luke's car for something fuel efficient, and on the day he died, Tim was up getting the cable set up for his son's apartment when he came home. He was always doing things for his son. He was a role model, not just as a journalist, but as a parent for all of us. And I think that's why there's been such an outpouring of love and support. Tim, you lived a terrific life. For all of us at NBC News, thank you.
Byron Brown is the mayor of Buffalo, New York. Mayor Brown, good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
Now, I got an email overnight from Senator Clinton, Senator Schumer, and the congressman there saying that Route 20 that goes past the stadium is going to be, they're going to put in legislation to rename the stadium, Tim Russert, or rename rather the route, the highway, that section of Route 20, Tim Russert Highway. Would that be welcome to the people of Buffalo, and do you?
Yes, I think that would be one fitting tribute. I've heard from the offices of Senators Clinton and Schumer and Congressman Brian Higgins, and that's something that they're talking about, and I think that that is something that the people of Buffalo and Western New York would really appreciate.
What was the importance to the people of Buffalo that Tim Russert, a man who by any other measure was famous, you know, well paid, living in Washington inside the Beltway, but what about the fact that he never forgot Buffalo and that it was so much a part of him?
Stanley Cup, I can feel it now. Big Russ, Buffalo
You know,
Sabres.
he wore Buffalo on his sleeve in so many ways. He was Buffalo. He really reflected the people, their strength, their resilience, their warmth. He was recognized as Buffalo's favorite son collectively, and also as our most famous son in this community.
Mr. Mayor, you know, a lot of cities like Buffalo, blue-collar cities, some cities in the Rust Belt have really suffered in the last couple of decades. And what did it mean to people there that he was their tribune?
You know, Tim was a real champion of the people of Buffalo. He always spoke fondly of his hometown, and he included Buffalo in so much of his work. He was a real source of pride and encouragement for the people of this community, and having a Tim Russert on the national scene was so uplifting for the people of Buffalo. So for all of us here, collectively, it really feels like we have lost a member of our family.
And Mr. Mayor, he didn't forget because he came back often and he did things, charitable works, good works, quietly and publicly.
You know, he never forgot his hometown. He came back often. You know, in this day and age where so many famous people don't relate to where they came from, Tim Russert never forgot Buffalo. He never forgot where he came from. He was not afraid to express his love for his hometown. And in return, the people of Buffalo were very excited and very enthusiastic about always expressing their love for him. And people relished those times when he came back to Buffalo and enjoyed having the opportunity to see him and to interact with him.
That legacy will live on. Thank you so much, Mayor Byron Brown, Buffalo, New York.